Welcome to Power Talk. My name is Kamal Franklin. To my left is Andre Moore, and sitting in for Neil Nelson is Tracy Donnelly. Take it away, Tracy.
Thank you, Kamal. One of the major stories that's been making headlines recently is a case of alleged sexual misconduct on the set of Bachelor in Paradise. On June 4th, it was reported that Corinne Olympios, I believe, and Demario, a black male, were engaged in sexual misconduct. A producer who was on the set, presumably was part of the filming crew, reported to his supervisors at Warner Brothers that he thought that misconduct was happening on the set. Warner Brothers immediately halted production, and then it became a huge story about what happened. There were very little details. No one really knew what happened. They just knew that misconduct took place, or allegedly. And soon after that, Kareem hired high-powered attorneys. Excuse me. She even hired a
Publicist.
publicist
Yeah.
and released a statement. And in that statement, she called herself a victim. She stated that she had little memory of what took place, and also said that she assumed that something bad must have happened because otherwise the producers would not have halted the show if something bad did not happen. In turn, Demario hired his own attorney in response. And said that he hopes to clear his name and is willing to take any legal action necessary to do so, and felt that his character is being assassinated. Um, so we want to delve a little bit deeper into what the implications of this kind of case is. But sexual assault is something that's very serious in this country, and it's something that we ourselves take very seriously. So I wanted to read off a couple stats that I think is important for us to note. 1 in 5 women and 1 in 71 men will be raped at some point in their lives. 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys will be sexually abused before they turn 18 years old. Rape is the most underreported crime. 63% of sexual assaults are not reported to the police. Only 12% of child sexual abuse is reported to authorities. So with those stats, especially for women, do they carry a heavier burden to prove the truth of what may or may not have taken place, and is it fair?
I think that in the justice system that we have, unfortunately, women do carry a heavy burden. You have incidents like this, which are aberrations. Apparently, I think you're going to talk a little bit more about the investigation Warner Brothers did, which seems to indicate that both parties were consensual. But there does, in this society today and historically, unfortunately, sexual assault, sexual violence is not always taken as seriously as it should be. I think the accusations that are made by women are because we have a male dominated sort of court system are taken lightly. And we've had several examples, I think, of women having to overprove a lot of times that some of these incidents take place. And what we also, is we're going to talk a little bit more, deal with the historical legacy of men, particularly black men, being targets of white women and a larger white community by being accused of sexual assault or sexual misconduct, and again having their lives taken away because of that. I think the use of sexual violence and sex as a weapon against the black community, again historically against black men and perpetrated against black women in the act of rape, is something that our community is still dealing with, and it still has implications for these modern times.
Yes, I think that women are a oppressed group in the United States, and I think historically their word has not has been diminished against accusations against men in particular. But I think it's an interesting mix when we have that black men or black people in general who are also an oppressed group, and the history, as Kamal mentioned, of black men being portrayed as being sexual predators, particularly towards white women. I think that there's a high burden of proof for him as well, in today's court system as it's configured. So it's an interesting mix when those two things are put, kind of put together in the court system.
So to kind of go back and give a bit more details, brothers in their investigation did find that there was no evidence of misconduct. Um, Both Corrine and Demario, according to documents, were both drunk. Some sources, it has not been confirmed, said that she was fully engaged. So in this case, is she strictly a victim? And as you guys spoke about the history of white women accusing black men of sexual assault and what that has resulted for black men being killed, being lynched, how do we kind of process the historical narrative of that playing itself over and over with a case like this?
I think it's difficult because you want to, when someone makes an accusation, we always have to remember that someone is innocent until proven guilty, but you have to take that accusation seriously. And it seems in this case that Warner Brothers did take this accusation seriously. They shut down production. They did an internal investigation. As far as I know, the young lady didn't go ahead and press any charges, but she did
Right.
lawyer up.
Right. High-powered lawyers.
Yes. So it seemed as if she was getting ready, rather, obviously if it's a criminal investigation, then there's prosecutors for that. But it also seems like, to be honest, that she was looking civilly in case she needed to or wanted to press charges against not only, or bring a civil case against the young man, but probably more importantly, Warner Brothers. So I think Warner Brothers, probably within its own interest, decided that we would need to halt production and do a thorough investigation. And I think, again, as is pointed out in the story, they hired their own separate law firm to do an investigation and had videotape of the actual encounter and concluded based on that videotape that no sexual misconduct had taken place, i.e., that they were both fully participants in this act, which also goes back to the idea of what was the person who reported it thinking when they saw what was taking place, I guess.
Yeah, I
Right.
think that's a good point because when you speak about the history of it, and and when we review that, you would see that in not every instance does the white woman have to be a perpetrator of false allegations against a black male. Observers of it could easily weaponize that against the black community.
Right.
And so I think that, we don't know to the exact role that she played. We don't have those details. I think it's interesting. There was a producer on set that brought it up, and we don't know what they were thinking, as you mentioned before. So, but I think it's a note that it doesn't require the woman involved to necessarily be the person who's falsely accused, and it can be an observer who plays up that kind of interracial encounter.
Right. And definitely in this case, there was video evidence, so he can consider himself lucky that there was, in fact, video evidence that they looked over and saw that there was no misconduct. Emmett Till and the others that have found themselves in the middle of those allegations that has led to their death didn't have that benefit of having evidence that showed that they in fact did not do what they were accused of doing. Is this something that black men should have an awareness of, that this in fact does happen, and how should they proceed and how they interact with certain groups of people?
I think for everybody, it's a cautionary tale of conduct of sexual conduct. I think we're in very complex times, and some of that is a good thing because that means that we're not at a level or at a stage where men feel that they can just get away with or do something that they have some sort of prerogative, or it's just horseplay, or it's just something that men do as locker room stuff, or whatever they can get away with. We've reached a point, at the very least, where these accusations are beginning to be taken a little bit more seriously. Whether or not people feel justice is being bestowed, I think that's sometimes in the eye of the beholder. But I definitely think just because of the history of underreported sexual assault, the sort of dichotomy we have around who gets believed more. It's a very sensitive subject. It's something that people need to be watchful of, careful of in terms of their conduct. How do you feel? I'm curious, like, how do you feel about it as a woman who works in a mostly male space, a woman who um, has, your engagement with the men? Do you feel like men in general have treated you in a certain way, or do you worry about that kind of stuff? I guess.
I don't worry about it in the sense that I feel that I am unsafe.
Mm-hmm.
I think that as a woman, it's important to to take personal responsibility. Granted, there are cases that's um, beyond your handling, where you're walking down the street and God forbid someone snatches
Mm-hmm.
you up.
Mm-hmm.
But in the case of Corinne, for example, I think that there is a sense of personal responsibility that has to come into effect here. If you are drunk and you're drunk to the point where you are unable to remember what took place,
Mm-hmm.
that's concerning.
Mm-hmm.
And I would personally not put myself in that kind of situation.
Yeah, I think when it comes to how today's, I think that sexual education has to be expanded to kind of include what are some of the other issues surrounding sex. I think now it primarily deals with being pregnant, STDs, and things of that nature. But I think that there are real life, also life destroying or life changing events that can occur with irresponsible sexual activity. So I think that we need to expand that beyond what's traditionally been spoken about in sexual education.
And I think also not to make the male the predator, to be perceived as only the predator and the woman is only the victim. Now, there are differences in physical ability, so a man is stronger most of the time, and
Mm-hmm.
he can, in fact, overpower a woman. But I think there's something to be said for women acknowledging the role that they may play
Mm-hmm.
and how they can have an impact on certain situations that may take place.
I think that's true. I mean, and it's also true that men um, need to be very careful about making sure that they have consent.
Right.
Absolutely.
Because obviously I think again it's when things start happening, people will make assumptions
Hmm.
that you can go this far and that means you can go all the way, and that may not be what the other party intended and or wanted. So I think
Hmm.
it's a very again, it's the type of environment that we're in where making sure that consent is something that's given, making sure that someone feels safe, making sure that both parties feel like they're responsible for their actions, can go a long way. I think in these nuanced cases, the
Right.
ones
Hmm.
that we do have, where it comes down to a he said she said thing. If at some point you feel like the person that you're engaging in is pulling back, withdrawing, and I think it's going to be totally up to a male to take that extra precaution and say,
Right.
no, I'm not. That's maybe
Yeah.
we should stop
Right.
And
that.
what's interesting is in the case of alcohol, and that we mentioned, um, who is to be blamed in that situation if
Right.
both people participants are impaired to some their judgment is impaired.
Hmm.
Is it that it's only for the woman who gets the benefit of the doubt, or should the male also get the benefit of the doubt as well? So that's a very interesting thing to think about, those kind of nuanced situations.
Hmm.
Right. And for the fact that they were both intoxicated, does it now mean that unfortunately it makes it more difficult now for other women who have in fact experienced sexual assault to come forward? They already carry the burden of proving that it took place. What does this case mean for them to now feel empowered, or are they now disempowered to continue to want to say that I'm going to report a case of sexual assault?
I think most of these, I'm going to call them celebrity sexual allegation cases, unfortunately, from the woman's perspective, has not done sort of justice in making folks feel safe. It feels like in terms of coming forward,
Mm.
um, it seems as if
It sounds like you want to talk about the Cosby
I did
case.
want to talk about the Cosby case.
Go ahead.
It seems as if it takes sort of a monumental amount of accusations for folks, one, to be taken seriously, Two, I think people who are professionals in terms of diagnosing or talking about issues of sexual violence, a lot of times report that sometimes women don't feel safe to come forward. They don't feel like their stories are going to believe. Sometimes they don't necessarily turn on their perpetrators. So there's a lot of stuff to unpack that I think, in terms of how some of these things have been playing out recently in the public eye, which doesn't make, I think, somebody feel that, male or female, I guess, if something has happened to them, that there's going to be some kind of swift justice, at least that they feel there's going to be a vindication. I think instead they feel like they're going to be dragged through a public scene, and whether or not that's going to result in some kind of justice, we just don't know.
Yeah, I think it's a very sticky situation. I think that whenever you cry wolf, it makes it very harder for people who are telling the truth. But I don't think that you can necessarily do anything against crying wolf because then again, that might discourage more women from coming out.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this is a very sticky situation, and also to consider the fact that when someone does cry wolf, that the male involved or the person who's being accused, that their life is also destroyed from that, and there's very little chance of coming back. Even in this brother's case, unless the videotape is released, I think he will be getting a side eye for the rest of his life as someone who's a potential sexual predator. And so I don't know exactly a
Yeah.
solution for how we deal with that, because it just seems that if you help one side, you hurt the other almost. Yeah.
Right, right. And in this case, there's the extra layer of race.
Hmm.
And like we mentioned, um, the history of black men, of white women rather, accusing black men of sexual assault. But does it reflect negatively on the society that women who are considered to be, or black women who are considered to be the most oppressed, does it reflect negatively on the society that they do not have a safe space to come forward and say when something like sexual assault has occurred?
I think so. I mean, I think it reflects negatively on the larger society. I think it reflects negatively within our own community about how seriously we sometimes take accusations of sexual assault. I think sometimes we get into a thing if someone should have known better or that
Mm.
kind of thing, as opposed to trying to suggest that we need to protect, and look out and try to provide safety or, like we said, safe spaces, for folks who are making these accusations. So I think, I think that in America, because everything is around sort of the publicity and money and that kind of stuff with these celebrity type cases. Again, I think they have a deflating effect on people's willingness to come forth, because they're not going to think that they're going to be believed, and they're not going to think that the police are going to investigate as hard, or they're not going to think that the prosecutor is going to take their case seriously. And I think because of those things, we don't really talk about this in a mass way in our community, to try to reach some sort of level of better understanding or better conduct.
Yeah, it's a complex situation because there's race, there's gender, there's race for both the women and the man. Because most in the instances the woman is considered, there's victim shaming.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And in the case of the men, like Dre mentioned, his life most times are ruined, whether he's guilty or not. But we are wrapping up, so I'd like you guys to give our final thoughts. It is a very complex issue, but how do we sort of move forward for both men and women who are caught in sexual assault situations, and for black men who may be the suspect within that? How do they
Mm-hmm.
proceed, or how do they interact in those situations?
Yeah. For one, I think that people in general, but in this case, black men, if you choose to, date interracially, interact interracially, do know that we do not exist in a post-racial society, and there are implications to that. Maybe not to yourself and the other individual involved, but to other people in large in the society who might be disturbed by seeing that interaction, and
Mm-hmm.
therefore, again, they can weaponize those kind of encounters against you. So just being aware of that, and as well as the other implications of what is considered sexual assault. Some people are confused about that, and so
That's true.
you can perpetrate it without even knowing, as well. So to make sure you're informed about that is very important, and as well as I don't really like to give women instructions on
Tread
on what they
lightly.
should do. So, but that as having a daughter myself, I would definitely inform her on how she should um, conduct herself and be aware of the situation and how her behavior could potentially um,
Have unwanted
yeah have
consequences.
consequences. Just being aware of what the consequences are of your actions.
Yeah, I have a young daughter, and no dudes are allowed in my house until she's like 5 or something like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, really quickly, I think the most important stat that you read off at the beginning of this is that um, that for the most part, it shows that about 5 or 10% of these kinds of cases actually are falsely reported, which means the vast majority have some substantial or some real evidence that support the fact that some sexual misconduct or violence or abuse took place. And again, these media cases allow us to talk about them, but they don't. But these are not obviously the everyday cases that people experience in unfortunately their everyday lives of work, home, within community, and unfortunately random violence. So I think it's something that we all have to continue to be aware of, talk about, and trying to find solutions that help benefit both men and women so that these things stop happening.
Well, thank you guys, and thank you everyone for watching Power Talk.